If you were to make a list of people whom you considered to be blessed, who would be on that list? My guess is that your list probably doesn't look quite like Jesus's list, because the people on his list include the poor, the hungry, the hated and reviled, the mourning, which are not usually blessed characteristics in most people's minds. You don't really see people on social media posting #blessed with a picture of their overdrawn bank account. Vloggers who start their stream with "too blessed to be stressed" generally don't go on to talk about how hungry they are. Our first thought when we see someone crying usually isn't, "Wow, they must be so blessed. Look at how sad they are." And when I count my blessings, like Bing Crosby tells us to in White Christmas, I don't usually include times when I have been excluded, reviled, and defamed on account of my faith life. No, our culture has a certain understanding of what it means to be blessed, and it usually involves an excess and abundance of all of the best things in life, right? Blessed people are happy. They're rich, they have loving families and go on awesome trips and have massive houses and fancy cars and the latest and greatest in techno-gadgetry. The folks that Jesus was preaching to would have had a similar understanding of what it meant to be blessed. Just, I suppose, without the tech part. And also probably it'd be fancy chariots instead of fancy cars. A few differences, but his words would have made most people scratch their heads in confusion, just as they do today. Because despite Jesus' best efforts, not much has changed with how we understand what it means to be blessed. Jesus is fighting an uphill battle in our gospel lesson for today, which is a sentence that I feel like could be applied to almost every gospel passage that we read. He's fighting against a deep-seated understanding that to be blessed means that you have received God's favor because you deserve it and are worthy of it, either because of who you were born as or because of the good things that you have done in life. And in turn, everyone knows that you have received God's favor because of how awesome your life is, which, on the surface isn't all that bad. We all like the idea of being rewarded for good behavior, and even more so if that is a blessing from God. But this way of thinking takes a dangerous turn when you look at the flip side, which says that when your life is less than awesome, that must mean that God has withdrawn God's favor, God's blessing from you, most likely because of something that you did. So we're left with this system that tells us that people who are rich and happy deserve their wealth and happiness and are that way because God has blessed them. And conversely, those who are poor and downtrodden, well, they must deserve their particular lot in life as well because of something bad that they did, which made them unworthy of God's blessing and favor. Today, that way of thinking is called the prosperity gospel, and Jesus is not a fan. He attempts to turn that understanding of what it means to be blessed on its head in this passage, which is more commonly known as the Beatitudes. And if it doesn't sound quite like how you remember the Beatitudes sounding, that could be because there are two different versions. One that comes from Matthew, and then this one that we have in Luke. The one from Matthew uses language that is much more poetic, while Luke's version is far simpler. Instead of "blessed are the poor in spirit," we simply have in Luke, "Blessed are you who are poor." Instead of "blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," we have "blessed are you who are hungry now." Matthew's version also has a lot more blessings than Luke's, 8 in all. There's so many, in fact, that Jesus has to double up on the rewards for some of them. I once read a book that imagined Jesus workshopping the Beatitudes with his disciples, and when he said, "Blessed are those of you who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," one of the disciples pointed out that Jesus had already promised the kingdom of heaven to the poor in spirit. So then Jesus toys with the idea of offering those who are persecuted a nice fruit basket for their troubles. Like I said, he's just workshopping it so the fruit basket doesn't make the final cut. But at any rate, Luke's version solves this problem by only having 4 blessings. But it complicates things a little bit by adding 4 woes. By including these 4 woes, Luke's version is able to even more clearly emphasize Jesus' redefining of how God's blessing works. Because he says, "Woe to you who are rich, you with full bellies, you who are laughing now, those of you who are well spoken of." It's a reversal, because these are all people that we would generally associate with living blessed lives. But for Jesus, God's blessing isn't some commodity or status symbol to be worn for everyone else to see as a signal to what a virtuous and wonderful person we must be. No, God's blessing is a deep and abiding peace, a promise that comes to us in the midst of the struggles and hardships about this life. That says, "I see you. I see how you are suffering, how you are struggling, and I am with you. You are not alone in this, and it will not be like this forever. I promise you that." God's blessing comes as words of both comfort and promise. Comfort to help us in our immediate situation, and promise for a reversal of our fate in the future. I also think that this whole passage speaks to the temporariness of our lot in life, which at times can feel so permanent and unchangeable. I saw a video clip of a roundtable discussion amongst different actors, and Tom Hanks was talking about what he wished that he had known earlier on in life. And he says, quote, "I wish I had known that this too shall pass." You feel bad right now? You feel pissed off? You feel angry? This too shall pass. You feel great? You feel like you know all the answers? You feel like everybody finally gets you? This too shall pass. Time is your ally, and if nothing else, just wait. Just wait. We need both the blessings and the woes, because they speak to us differently, depending on where we are in life, which situation we find ourselves in at the moment that we hear them. Because sometimes we need that reminder that God hasn't abandoned us, that promise that things will get better. And sometimes when we are riding high and everything seems to be going our way, we need to be reminded just how quickly things can turn sour. And that even that change in circumstance serves a purpose. The suffering and the hardships that we experience in life provide us with perspective and context. Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are hungry, for you will be filled, and what's more, you will appreciate that full belly even more because you know what it feels like to have an empty one." And the same is true for the woes. That sting of an empty belly is that much sharper after we have been full. But fear not. And here's where it gets even more confusing, because now that we are empty, we become the hungry, whom God chooses to bless and comfort with the promise of being filled once again. It's a full circle process, a Ferris wheel of blessings and woes, if you will, which honestly sounds like a terrible theme park attraction, but stick with me. Hopefully, as a result of riding that Ferris wheel around a few times, when we are at the bottom, we can look with hope and encouragement towards the top. And when we are at the top, we will be more attuned to our neighbors at the bottom, because we've been there ourselves and could be back sooner than we realize. It helps remind us not to take those good things for granted, and even more, it calls us to look around and recognize who is missing out, who isn't at the table with us. Because there's a justice piece to all of this blessing and woe stuff, and it relates to what's called God's preferential option for the poor. It's a theological concept that had its beginnings in the liberation theology movement amongst Latin American Catholics in the 1960s. Essentially, it holds that God will always side with, advocate for, and accompany the downtrodden, the oppressed, the outcast, the other. Those whom this world would never label as being blessed are exactly the ones whom God chooses to bless. Jesus said as much when he read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and told us about his mission to bring good news to the poor. Now, I'll admit, when I first learned about this idea in seminary, I struggled with it a little bit. Not that God would do all those great things for people in need. That part is awesome. But implied in this line of thinking, or so I thought at the time, is that if God is for some people, that must mean that God is against others, right? That's just common sense. If we are not the poor, if we're not the oppressed and the marginalized with whom God sides and favors and blesses, then that must mean that God is against us. But that is a very black and white way of thinking about a God who operates using every color of the rainbow. I was trying to force God into a very human dichotomy. If you're not with us, you're against us. But as we all know, God absolutely loves breaking free from our human desire to categorize and boxify the divine. God's goal of siding with and advocating for and blessing the poor among us is not done in an attempt to further divide us, but rather to unify us by bringing all of us into solidarity with those who need it most at that particular moment. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer once put it, we must, quote, see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. Bonhoeffer believed that was the most productive perspective that Christians could take when viewing the world and its affairs. And then I saw this tweet just this morning, and I had to fit it into my sermon last minute, but it summarizes it beautifully. Father Joseph Krupp says, "Father, if there is a schism, a divide in the church, how will we know who is right? Follow the poor. Whichever side chooses for the poor and most vulnerable, follow that one, because that is where Christ is." And while we could apply this lens to any number of real-world examples, given our proximity to the border and the current state of things, immigration seems like a particularly pertinent one. This past week, I, along with Pastor Laura, Deacon Mindy, and 8 other members of Bethlehem, attended the Pacifica Synod's Day of Theological Reflection. The topic for the day was immigration and border concerns. We heard from Pastor Manuel Retamosa, who spoke of his dual identity as both Cherokee and Mexican and how the border has changed over the course of his life just in the last 50 years. We heard John Fanistil, who detailed the history of Friendship Park and his hopes for its future. And we heard from Pastor Maria Santa Cruz, assistant to the Bishop for Latine Ministries, and her own immigration journey. And we concluded the day by traveling down to a section of the border wall known as Whiskey 8 for worship and communion. Now, however you feel about matters of immigration and the border, I think we can all agree that the system is broken. Pastor Laura said the same last week when she spoke of the informational event that we hosted for our near neighbors. Our system tears families apart, turns away individuals who have no home to return to. Some people have the red carpet rolled out for them, while others are told to get to the back of a 15-year-long line. And so at this event, we came together to discuss these realities, to view immigration matters not through a political lens or a partisan lens, but through a human lens, through a lens that sees the suffering and the heartache that people are experiencing. Because as the Bible reminds us, we too were once strangers in this land. And for those of us who have ridden that Ferris wheel of blessings and woes around and are at the top, we are called to be in solidarity with and advocate for those who are struggling at the bottom. And that will look different for each of us, whether it's seeking out further education, engaging in advocacy, allyship, or support, or even volunteering in our after-school tutoring program. We are called to do whatever we can to look at this problem through a human lens and seek to let those that are suffering know that God has a word of blessing just for them. That if Jesus were here today, he would say, "Blessed are the asylum seekers and the refugees, for they will find peace. Blessed are those who are longing for a better life for their family, for they will find hope. Blessed are those who have been forgotten and turned away, for in God they will always find welcome. The Beatitudes are one of Jesus' most famous teachings. They are not, however, one of the easiest to understand. They are complicated and complex. They break long-standing societal norms and ways of understanding the world. They are meant as both comfort and warning, promise and prophecy, words to build us up when we are feeling broken and to guide us when we are whole. So whether you are in need of blessings, woes, or some combination of the two, Jesus has a message that is just right for you as well. Amen.